Hi, I'm Lizzie, one of the hosts on the Green Room podcast. Baby boomers, millennials, Gen Z, and even Generation Alpha. We love labels, don't we? For the first time, there's 5 different generations in the workplace. We wanted to find out more. So for episode 46, we asked, does when we're born affect how we work? And no, I promise I won't make you feel old. We were joined by 2 fantastic guests, Bobby Duffy, Professor of Public Policy at King's College London, and our very own Shivani Maitra, partner in Deloitte Consulting and private sector practice lead. You can listen to previous episodes on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Enjoy. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave us a comment too with your thoughts on today's question.
Hello and welcome to The Green Room by Deloitte, a podcast exploring the topics that matter most in business. I'm George Parrett, and this episode we're asking, does when we're born affect how we work? Hello and thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Green Room. You can find all of our previous episodes on our brand new shiny website, which is deloitte.co.uk/Green Room Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts from. And today we're talking generational stereotypes from Gen Alpha to Gen Z. And I'm delighted to be joined by someone who is always young at heart, my lovely co-host, Lizzie Elston. How are you, Lizzie?
I'm young at heart, George. Yeah, really excited about this discussion. Looking at some of the myths and dispelling some of the myths, but importantly applying it to the workplace. So looking forward to getting stuck in.
That's absolutely right, Lizzie. And as usual, we need some experts on this show to really guide us through this topic. So who's in the studio with us this week?
So I'm delighted to introduce, first of all, Bobby Duffy. Bobby is Professor of Public Policy at King's College London and Director of the Policy Institute. He has worked within policy research and evaluation for 30 years and was previously seconded to the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit. Bobby is the author of 2 books, The Perils of Perception, Why We're Wrong About Nearly Everything, and Generations, Does When You're Born Shape Who You Are? Welcome, Bobby.
Great to be here.
I'm also delighted to introduce Shivani Maitra. Shivani is a partner in Deloitte's Consulting London office, where she leads the private sector practice, with a focus on retail and consumer businesses. She has over 22 years of experience in human capital and has extensive experience of leading large, complex transformation programs across the private sector. Welcome, Shivani.
Thank you.
So this is the point at which we have an icebreaker question, which should hopefully pop up on my screen. And the question is this: if you could choose to be one age forever, what age would you choose and why? Who's going to leap into that one?
I'm happy to dive in there, Lizzie, because I've got a 7-year-old daughter, and I just think, it doesn't really get much better after you're 7, does it? So I think in the spirit of Peter Pan, I think there's a wonderful age of innocence at 7 where you get driven around everywhere. You go to parties all the time. It's TV's great. You don't really know about the news that much. So I think I'm happy to live as a 7-year-old. Yeah.
You're definitely onto something there, George. My 10-year-old social life is definitely better than mine. It's like constant parties. So I think I'm going to have to identify with what you've just said and agree. It's that sort of slot of your childhood where you haven't got the pressures of sort of exams or schooling ahead of you, and you can just enjoy life. So, yeah, I think I'm on the same page as you.
Yeah, that is tempting when you think about it. Though I've got kids of a similar age, and they still have worries, and you inflate your worries relative to your landscape, I guess. So they've still got. So I'd go with my 20s. I'd say sort of reasonably mid-20s, where just you recovered from anything. Yeah, you could do anything and still recover and function, and options seemed open. I mean, there is lots of research on what's the happiest time of life, and it is earlier on in life, and the midlife dip is real. So I definitely wouldn't choose my current age, which is more or less the absolute pit of average life satisfaction levels. It does get better again as you get older, but not as much. as it was when you were young. So I'd go for that mid-20s sort of time.
I'm going to go against the grain a little bit, and I think I would like to stay the age I am right now, so sort of post 45. So I'm 47 right now, and I just feel I have the wisdom of, all the mistakes I made as a young person. I'm far more patient, far more tolerant, but I also think I know myself the best now. I know what I want from life, what to get sort of anxious or stressed about, and what to let go. I've never felt better about myself. And, I'm at a stage where I know when to say no to something and be comfortable with, not feeling FOMO. I actually suffer from JOMO. So I would say, yeah, my current age. I'm very happy where I am.
This is very reassuring, Shivani. So thank you very much. This is there is light at the end, I think, for us. But I think we need to get stuck into this this topic as a whole, really, and it really stems from generational stereotypes, doesn't it? And I think that we can all think about various headlines and things in recent years. I identify as a millennial, and I think we're often to blame for spending too much money on avocados and things. And those are some of the stereotypes which I've encountered, perhaps. But what are some of the what do we mean when we're talking about generational stereotypes? And whether that's today or whether it's a new thing or whether that's something that's always been there. Bobby, perhaps is your best place to answer that one.
Yeah. It's there's a lot going on there in that question, because it's the central premise of the book that I wrote is basically in one sentence. It is that generational thinking is an incredibly powerful idea that you see throughout history from some of the biggest thinkers in philosophy and sociology and other spheres, but it's been horribly corrupted by these terrible stereotypes, myths and cliches. And I think our task, and hopefully in this conversation, is to hold on to the big idea and get rid of the myths and stereotypes. And I think the question about has that always been the case? Not quite. I mean, I think it's always been the case that we've denigrated young people. You can go to any era in history, and the older people will always think this is the worst generation of young people ever that we've ever seen. You can go back to Socrates, 400 BC, saying in a massive long diatribe against the young people in his day, saying they lack manners, show disrespect, prefer leisure to activity and gossip. And you could apply that today. We did actually ask that in a poll of the British public, and half of people agreed that was true of young people today. But you can go to any era in history and you will find people denigrating young people. I think the thing that's slightly different now is we've got this labelling, very shorthand, snappy labelling, and an information environment that really thrives on that, where you've got this image of millennials, Gen Z or boomers, that is very easily translatable into clickable headlines, where millennials are killing this or killing that, or boomers ruined everything. There's loads and loads of articles. There's actually artworks that bring together all of the headlines on things millennials have killed, supposedly killed, including things like the napkin industry and all sorts of nonsense linked to what millennials are supposed to have done wrong. So that's different. That is different. We've got this generational labelling focus that allows us to stereotype, and a lot of it is just good fun and shorthand. But I also think it is can be quite destructive, because those stereotypes stick, and it emphasises a generational separation and conflict often that doesn't really exist.
Shivani, what about sort of what you're seeing through your work and how sort of these stereotypes are playing out? What are you seeing?
So I think I just want to build on what Bobby said, which is I think generational differences have always existed and will continue to exist. I think what is exacerbating it is, first of all, how many generations are alive today, if I can just put it that way, right? People are living longer. So you will find 90-year-olds, 90-plus-year-olds, as well as the 15, 16-year-olds who are extremely opinionated, right? And you have all these voices and all these opinions. So not only is there a generational clash, there is a significant cultural clash, right? So that's what's playing out. And I guess the second element is probably happened previously, but the digital world has made it louder, right? everyone has access to a phone. Everybody can put their opinions out there. So more and more people are talking, more and more people are reading and listening to what others are saying and reacting to it. So it might be something really small, but its effect has been multiplied several times over because of, dare I say, the internet and what digitalization and social media has done to those voices. So what is happening at work is, look, I work across generations. I work with very, very senior partners and very senior clients. I also work with incredibly young people who are in their first, maybe second jobs and are still coming to terms with what the working world looks like. Is there a generational clash? I wouldn't call it a clash. I think there is somewhere a difference of opinion and therefore a rebalancing of expectations, right? So for instance, younger people are more comfortable talking about, their mental health. They are more comfortable talking about stress and burnout. When I think of myself as a 22, 23-year-old in the consulting world, sure, I suffered from burnout. Sure, I suffered from stress, but I didn't talk about it because it wasn't the done thing, right? So that's the big difference. So I think there's a little bit of adjustment that happens.
That's really interesting, Shivani, and I think we'll definitely drill into some of those workplace factors that you mentioned. But I just had a sort of a bit of a basic question, and Bobby, you sort of alluded to it there. But where do these I don't know, categories or stereotypes come from? The labelings, as you described it. Is it just purely down to when someone was born in a particular society? Does it change in different societies, or how has it come about? And obviously the media and readers and consumers of the media have sort of driven it. But is it purely based on your birth certificate?
Yes, yeah, they are defined by year of birth, and that's and where it comes from is it's quite organic in terms of where it starts from. There's a whole range of different sources for these different labels. The baby boomer, the kind of first group, is based on a demographic reality of there was a baby boom in many countries, not all countries, post-war, and that was the U.S. Census Office is kind of attributed to that label. Then Gen X is much more of a cultural definition. So you've got baby boomers first, 1945 to 1965. Then Gen X comes through 1966 to 1979 birth years, and that's more a cultural. There's no kind of demographic reality related to that. That's much more about the slacker generation, and it comes from Douglas Copeland's book called Gen X, Generation X. And then you have millennials, which comes from 1980. It runs from 1980 up to 1995, 96 in most people's definitions, and that was coined by two American authors who wrote about generations in the US, and then Gen Z just naturally follows from millennials, which was originally called Gen Y after Gen X, and then, as you say, there's even Gen Alpha coming through now in lots of people's submission, and you can see that's quite a US-driven framing. There is something to be said for taking this generational frame more globally across, because we're so much more interconnected through the economy and through cultural sharing. But still, there are very different conditions in India, China, Southeast Asia, and Africa, generally, with very different population profiles, very different economic experiences. And one of the big elements of generational formation is, does the future look better for the current generation of youth compared to previous generations of youth? We got very used to generation on generation progress in places like the UK, and that has stalled in places like the UK and the US. We haven't made that same sort of progress in income and wealth. But in other fast-growing economies and markets, that is still going on. So there's clearly a different perspective depending on what nation you're in, these generations. But I think there's more cause now to think of them globally as well, because we're so interconnected through things like social media.
And Bobby, picking up on something you said earlier about, it can be almost quite destructive to be using the sort of the language around this. Can you go into a bit more detail on that? I'm quite interested in sort of, I guess, the pros and the cons of identifying these different generations and what it might mean.
Yeah, it's a very live debate in academic circles and then increasingly in more the think tanks and consultancy world as well, because and particularly driven from the US again, where there's a real move for dropping the labels, that these are doing more harm than good from the academic sector. There was an open letter from 150 academics to the Pew Research Center in the US, who do a lot of great work on generational analysis, saying, can we just ditch these because they're creating more heat than light in terms of how people think about them. So the cons are that they are constructs that cover vast swathes of the population. Huge percentages, millions of people, tens of millions of people in the US that fall into these generations, and then ascribing a summation, a kind of overview of that whole swathes of tens of millions of people of being a particular characteristic, like woke or whatever it is.
Snowflake.
A snowflake is, and the criticism is that it's closer to astrology than analysis, and these are can be more like horoscopes than anything else when you're trying to make these huge generalizations about vast swathes of the population that have huge diversity in them. And in the US in particular, quite a lot of the criticism is around how does this intersect with race, because you've got these images of Gen Z and millennials that are not very diverse in people's minds. So you've got to be clear about the diversity of that. I mean, in the end, my conclusion is, as I said at the beginning, is we got to try to keep the big idea of generations, because they are important. When you're born has got an important effect on you as part of this mix, because you grew up in different circumstances, and we know that your formative years are very important to shaping you for the rest of your life. So we need to keep hold of that quality of analysis and thinking. And there's one little framework that I think is the most important thing in the book and the analysis that I've been doing, learning about over decades, it's the difference between age, period, and cohort effect. So, or life cycle, period, and cohort effect. So there's those three effects explain all change in society. It's either to do, and at an individual level, it's either to do with your life cycle, where you are in your life cycle. We change as we age in all sorts of different ways. But it's also affected by what's going on now, period effects. So something happens and we all change, an economic crisis or a pandemic, and it affects all of us to some degree. Then the third effect is cohort effects, where a generation is different and stays different from another generation. And understanding the mix, those three things happen all the time and are intermingling, interacting with each other. But understanding which one's dominant is really, really important for understanding not just now and history, but the future. One interesting one that we may get onto in discussions is that the push for social purpose in brands and organizations is much more a period effect than it is a cohort effect. It's a really interesting one of, it's actually to do with a general change in interest in being connected to brands and employers that do good than it is driven by Gen Z as a cohort. They are a bit more like that than the rest of the population, but we've all become a bit more like that, a bit more interested in what our employers are doing. This partly goes back to what Shivani was saying about the digital environment. It's partly because it's just much more easy to find out what your company is actually doing and what it stands for. You can't have a really nice mission statement and then not act on it, or very nice values, because people will find out. So we've got much more information to judge whether our brands and employers live up to the values they espouse than we did in the past. So we're kind of much keener on that as individuals. So it's got lots of power, this framework, to understand now and the future. But it just gets dragged back to those stereotypes too often. My personal position in the end is it's keep the analysis, ditch the stereotypes. Don't try to get rid of the labeling, because it's out there now. And if we step away from the labeling, you'll just leave all the bad analysis still using the labeling of millennials killing marmalade or the Olympics or whatever it is. That will remain, and it will continue in the media for clicks. And I think our job is to do the really good analysis to counter that, rather than try to get rid of labels that are already out. A genie's out of the bottle on that, unfortunately.
That's a really interesting take, Bobby. And actually, Shivani, good to get your thoughts on whether generational labeling is good or bad in the world of work. And I think that we're now in a world. You mentioned how long we're all living now. I think there's 5 generations in the workplace for the first time ever. So great to get your sense on that labeling point specifically, and whether it's having different categories of generations is a good or bad thing.
Don't know about good or bad. Well, I think I do. It's just easy, right? And just want to pick up on a point Bobby made about where are you in your life cycle, as a person. And the millennials made a lot of noise, or rather, there was a lot of noise about millennials and how millennials are challenging everything and how they're going to change the status quo, etc. But millennials today, at least when we look at the workplace, are in very, very senior positions. They are charting the course of organizations. They are taking many of these unpopular decisions, right? And if I look at millennials, and I'm probably 5 years out from being a millennial, right? Just kind of missed the boat. But actually, what are their expectations? Their expectations are progression, career progression. They want the right salaries, right earning potential. They want that home. They want to send their children to the big schools. It's no different from what sort of Gen Xers have been accused of in the past. Right? So that life cycle angle is pretty significant. And personally, if I had a choice, I would actually do away with all and any label anyway. And it's interesting, when I speak to some of the Gen Zers at work, they are not in favor of labels either, because they find it counterproductive. And for them, it's not just the generational labeling, it is labeling for any kind. For instance, when we talk about gender equality and race equality, etc., that movement was actually, the noise around that was started by millennials, right? In terms of the conversation we started having openly at work. Gen Z want to take it for granted. Why are we even having this conversation is what they often ask, right? Everyone should be who they want to be, and why is it a point of distraction? Why is it a point of conversation? And I kind of fall in that camp, which is, why are we talking about it? That's my view. Because actually, when I look at the way we work, right, in a consulting environment, it's a very project-based environment. The minute you're in a team, please leave your different hats outside, because you're coming together as a team. Everyone's opinion is important. Everyone has a right to ask a question. And frankly, everyone is responsible and accountable. And I'm not interested in whether someone's a millennial and someone is a boomer. What I am interested in is everyone is treated with respect, and everyone's personal circumstances and situations are taken into account, and everyone has the choice around work-life balance, working from home, all the stuff that we've been talking about for a really long time. That's what makes teams thrive. That's what makes us productive. And that's what the focus should be.
It's such an important point. And I think one of the conclusions I came to, more on the analytical side, is the generational label should only ever be used when you're looking at true cohorts. So tracking the same birth year group over time. Using these labels as shorthand for age is a very disruptive thing to do. So instead of saying currently it would be 18 to 26, 27-year-olds as Generation Z, you call them Gen Z. So instead of using just their age group, thinking of them as young people, because you're messing up that key distinction between, is this a cohort effect or just an age effect? So are the things that we're looking at here in the workplace to do with them being born at a particular time, or is this just a need or a behavior that all young people have always shown and needed, or support or development that they've always needed? And the biggest source of generational myths is mixing up age with cohort. Some of the researchers in this sort of space make the observation that we have lots and lots of protected characteristics in all sorts of spheres, including the workplace. But they don't apply to these generational labels. People are quite happy to say Gen Z are lazy or entitled, but you would never say the same about you couldn't say the same about someone's age or ethnicity or gender. You would not ascribe those types of lazy labels to the groups in that way. But for some reason, we think it's all right for generational labeling to do that. And that's a really important part about how you use these labels. Never use it as shorthand for age groups.
And I think it's really interesting because it creates an environment of perceived attributes that doesn't. And Bobby, you made the point of how, I think, the media perceives Gen Z as to be driving the sustainability agenda, but actually it's all of society has progressed on that front, and it's not just the sort of Greta Thunberg's doing it. But in the context of in the workplace, Shivani, things like flexible working and those sort of purpose-led driven working tasks. Is that a generational thing, or as you say, it's too dangerous to label it? But I think it's hard to get away from it sometimes.
So I tend to agree with Bobby that actually when it comes to important issues like climate change, sustainability, I think all of us are interested in individuals, organizations, governments doing the right thing. I suspect if you'll just look at Generation Z, if you were to stick with that demographic, they are looking at one existential crisis after another. It's been one thing after another. It's been COVID. It's been massive climate change. And most of them actually think we are at a tipping point. And then there's been the war in Ukraine. And then there's the cost of living crisis. And you just look at it from their perspective, they have no choice but to shout and demand, right? So while we all probably tend to agree, they are talking more about it, which is why Greta Thunberg is the most well-known 16-year-old or 17-year-old on the planet today, because she's shouting and she's being very unapologetic about it. Because for that generation, this is an existential crisis. So I kind of see on some issues, yes, we can say they are louder. And because they are unapologetic, they are not shy from asking these questions of employers and demanding some visible action and outcomes.
And actually, we've got some. Sorry, Shah. We got some research from our Global Human Capital Trends report, which is a big study that we do with 10,000 business leaders, and I think it shows just to that point, 2 in 5 Gen Zs, millennials, have rejected a job or a task because it didn't align with their personal values, and I think that's quite...
And of course, George, Lizzie, you both are aware of the focus we as a business are putting on 999 profit, right? And that is going to become bigger and louder. And I come back to the point that probably we all believe that these are the right things to do, but Generation Z is finding itself in a position where if they don't shout, nothing's going to happen. And, that's the generation that will have to live with some of the choices X, the baby boomers, millennials make on their behalf.
Did you know at Deloitte we support social enterprises through our 5 Million Futures programme? Like Change Please. They use 100% of the profits from their award-winning coffee to help people experiencing homelessness. They offer training, employment and ongoing support with housing, finances and therapy. Why not sign up to the Change Please Coffee Club to receive weekly deliveries of coffee beans? Or try out one of their blends. Just head to changeplease.org or check out the show notes. Now back to our topic of the day.
My grandparents would say, well, it's the younger generations have got the tools and the technology and the platforms to shout now, which perhaps they didn't when they were that age. So, but again, it's the perception. Is that a fair point to make, or am I stirring it up too much?
The amplification was a lot limited, but I was talking to somebody else the other day, and I said, if you look back at post Second World War US, and the Bob Dylan followers and the music and the culture of those times, I suspect they used the tools available to them at that point in time, which was your rock concerts and what was it, Glastonbury and the like, to amplify their message and their concern. I think the culture of our times is a good way to look at how that generation was using the tools available to it.
What do you think, Bobby? I mean, personally, I don't want to think about my parents in the summer of love, but is that a fair lens to look at it?
You're way too young, Parrett. I know. I'm like with Summer of Love. Maybe the kind of 1990s Summer of Love. Yes, I mean, I think look, there's a really, really important point on climate, which is that there's a risk in setting up the youngest generations as being the ones who are angry and pushing for change on their own. And the risk, it's a really interesting one because you see former President Obama does this a lot, lionizing the coming generation of being the people who really understand social inequality and climate, and they're going to be the ones that make the change. And I can understand why you would do that, because it's sort of trying to give courage and recognize the real efforts that generation are making. The danger of it is, though, that it creates a sense of separation between the generations on climate, which is, of all the things that we need people to come together on, it's climate change. So the challenge is a bit here is that when you actually look at the data nowadays, baby boomers and Gen X just as worried about the climate as younger people. There's like a few percentage point differences now, nothing like the image you would get from some of the treatments of this. So when Time magazine made Greta Thunberg their Person of the Year in 2019, they called her an avatar in a generational battle. And you're like, that's not the way to set this up, because what you're doing is you're giving the message to older people that they don't care about climate, that it's normal within their generation not to care, and they're the problem. And the trouble with that is we know that social norms, your perception of social norms for your group, are very important in shaping your own behaviour. So we're dividing the population by age and generation on climate when we need them to come together. But it's not true when you look at the data, and even when you look at things like behaviours around things like boycotting products or services for social purpose reasons. It's actually baby boomers and Gen X who do that more than the younger generations, and that's partly a life cycle effect. As you've got a bit more choice, a bit more money, you're probably a bit grumpier at that kind of age, and you do those types of things. So I think there's a really delicate line to tread of giving courage and encouragement to the younger generations without also then giving the message that older people are sort of either off the hook or don't care enough, and then that disconnects them. If you look at, you just have to look at Extinction Rebellion and other marches and look at the age profile of the people there. It is everyone.
So, I mean, the thing that's sort of coming out loud and clear here for me is that there's more similarity almost than there are differences, and we need to focus on that. So if we talk a bit about how we actually start to bring people together more, what are some of the actions that we should all be taking to sort of dispel the myths and the division and actually come together better?
Well, I mean, the really important part of context to this is the very unseen or not noticed enough trend has been the extent of generational separation that we've seen in the past few decades. It's not conflict that's the big generational trend. It's separation. When the American academics look at this, they say we are living through a dangerous experiment in age segregation, where we're living in physical spaces more separately than humans have in their history by age, where young people have been sorted into cities, more urban areas, older people outside cities and in more rural areas. And we did some analysis for same sort of patterns in the UK, and there's this incredible separation as large towns and cities are getting younger and places outside that are getting older, only from the 1990s in the UK. And the interesting thing is, when you ask people about this in surveys, you'd say, do young people tend to live in cities, older people tend to live outside? Large majority of people say yes, that's the case. But if you ask them, has that always been the case? They will also say yes, that this, when actually it's only the last 20, 30 years that this has been happening. So we've got very used to this idea that we live separately in physical spaces, different physical spaces by age. then on top of that, as Shivani is saying, our digital life's hugely more important to us, and we are doing different things into different intensities online by generation and age. So we've got this really powerful separating things in both physical space and then digital space. And that's a problem because that space creates room for misunderstanding, stereotypes, conflict, all of those types of things. And so much evidence about from contact theory and lots of other work that coming into contact with each other in the right kind of environment increases understanding between people and empathy between people. So I think getting to your point, I think one of the key things we've got to do is find those spaces where generations come together. And again, as you've all been saying, workplaces are an incredibly important element of that. It's become more and more, as things like religion has declined and physical communities have declined, all these spaces where people came together across the generations are lessened. It means workplaces become more and more important about how do you bring the generations together in the workspace.
And Shivani, you talked about how in your teams that you work with, it's you leave the labels at home. It's a group of colleagues of all different ages tackling a problem for a client and working together and collaboratively. How do you achieve that, and what is the impact from working like that?
So I think the tone you set from the top, and here I'm going to and this is not a generational thing, it's just where you are, in your station or your status in the organization becomes very important. And I think that is a responsibility for the leadership, the tone that it sets, how hierarchical or not the organization is. Is it a culture where everyone, it's a democratic culture at work, so to speak. I think everybody has a voice, and respect, inclusion, equity is very, very important. So you have to create the right vibe, the right environment, the right circumstances. So I think that's one. The second is the tooling is very important, right? We see a lot of people for whom hybrid work has worked immensely well. And then there are some people who want to come to work every day. And I think technology for good, we still haven't fully exploited the power of technology to bring generations together. Currently, it's only seen as a separator, as a divider. I think actually technology can be a force for good in even bringing different people, I will not say different generation, different people together. I think it can be a force for unification. So I guess that's the second thing. The third and the final thing for me is we have to stop using labels anywhere, right? If I just look at media, the way news is reported, if I look at some of the advertisements, if I look at movies, you tend to highlight differences. And I wonder if there's an opportunity, if, George, I look at, you talked about the Human Capital Trends Report. If I read the Human Capital Trends Report in conjunction with our Millennial and Gen Z survey, they're both saying the same thing. And I think as Deloitte, we have such a loud voice. We need to use this as an opportunity to talk about the similarities then, that actually we spoke to very senior business leaders for one, and for very, very young people, and to very, very young people for the other. And they're essentially saying the same thing.
I'm thinking, well, we've been having this conversation about generations, and I fear I might go off a bit of a tangent here, but one of the things I've been thinking about is time of your life as opposed to when you were born. And I'm exactly the same age as you, Shivani, and I don't think anything prepared me for the time I'm in now, where there are challenges with aging parents and supporting and dealing with that, and also challenges with children. And then sort of, one's own personal challenges that you face as at this point in your life. And it's, I don't know if I have a particular question here. It was more just an observation that regardless of when you're born, you will get to this stage in your life and you have different challenges at different stages. And it's important to find people that you can talk to about that, I guess.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's the power of life cycles. And it's like, I think of those three things, those three different effects as generations and cohort effects are like massive tides that rise and fall, and they're really powerful, but quite slow moving, and there's not as big differences between them as you might like. And then period effects are like waves, and they kind of lap at the shore, and they can change the shoreline slowly over time, and that's like changing fashions or cultures, or they can be massive effects like tsunamis, waves, and just wipe things away. It's like a pandemic. But then life cycles are like currents that pull us along a path, a fairly consistent path across different generations. You do go through quite similar stages, and currents are incredibly powerful too. They kind of shape the climate of the planet, how the currents are flowing as well. But one of the key points is, and so yes, absolutely, it pulls us back into line. Even if a cohort or generation is quite different, you will start to go through these sorts of effects of your own health, your parents' health, looking after your kids, that middle crush in life. Millennials are starting to tip into now, and then Gen Z will follow, and it'll make them more similar to the rest of us through that powerful current effect. One important thing, though, is that those currents do change over time, and there is a very clear trend of delayed adulthood and delayed stages for more younger generations, staying in education longer, living at home longer, getting married later, having kids later. All of those types of things happen at slightly different points in the life cycle. So you've got this kind of lovely, rich blend of these different effects going on and shifting over time. And as employers, and as well as people providing services and products, you need to understand how those things shift. There's some constants there, but they still move over time.
Thanks, Bobby. It's such an interesting topic, and I think we could literally spend decades talking about this. I think, and it's an age old problem. But Shivani and Bobby, thank you so much for taking the time to really scratch the surface on this huge topic. And I think, as always, we end with the big question of the episode, which is
George. Before you ask that big question, I've got another big question before we get to the final big question, which is: are millennials killing the marmalade industry? Because that's the first I've heard about it, and it makes me sad because I love marmalade.
No, they're not. They're not.
Good.
You're fine. There's quite a lot of millennials making marmalade. So
That's what I was about.
Swings and roundabouts. They were supposed to have killed the Brussels sprout as well. Every year, a generation gets accused of killing the Brussels sprout, but that keeps happening because Brussels sprouts are horrible, and every generation wants to try and kill them.
Bobby, you have to try my recipe then. I'm still very well.
Oh, I think Paddington's doing a good PR job for marmalade, isn't he? I think so. So in a nutshell, then, Bobby and Shivani, if you could answer this week's big question, does when we're born affect how we work, Shivani?
To an extent, but not fully.
Excellent. I love that. It's a very tweetable answer, that one. Bobby, how about you? Does when we're born affect how we work?
Not as much as you think.
Fantastic.
So I love the nice, succinct answers. That's
I think it's like any sort of othering trope, isn't it? I think the lesson that we can all learn is it doesn't really pay to fear or other these things. It's about working collaboratively and breaking down these barriers as much as possible. But it's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. Thank you, Bobby and Shivani, so much. And we'll try and make sure we stick all of the various links to books and reports and things that we mentioned in the show notes. But thank you very much.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, it was excellent. Really good point. Lovely to meet you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Green Room by Deloitte. We'll be back next time with another big question. This podcast is produced by our very own pod squad and hosted by George Parrett, Lizzie Elston and Ethan Worth. Thanks to our creative studio for their technical support. Original music by Ali Barrett from our consulting team.